Let's begin with that fundamental unit of Renaissance society, the family. Last week, we left off with the image of Michelangelo's Holy Family. The image of the Holy Family was not just a crucial tenet of Catholic dogma, but was really the cornerstone of society, and for those who had not joined holy orders, emulating the matrimonial harmony that was so often depicted in the trope of the Holy Family, was really the most noble place, the most noble aspiration in society, a male and female together could achieve. The Virgin Mary herself was venerated as a pure vessel that brought the Christ child into this world and then raised him. The very popular image of the Madonna enthroned, seen here in the work of Tuscan artist Masaccio, glorifies her for just that. So she is literally the seat from which the infant Christ sees and is seen by the world. Hers was the ultimate model for women to emulate. Women, their biology, their morals, their intellect, have been the subject of much debate, practically since time immemorial. But in medieval and early Renaissance medical knowledge, for example, which was based heavily on translations of the second century AD physician Galen, saw women, or depicted women, as imperfect creatures whose union with man to procreate was really their sole purpose in life. Galenic medicine, which was used widely in medieval Europe by physicians, really envisioned the world and all its creatures therein as ruled by humors, temperatures, and elements. So according to Galen, women were naturally colder and men hotter, and he believed that men's genitalia was external and women's was internal because female gonads were too cold to emerge from her body, thus making her a lesser creature. Of course, aside from her perceived biological inferiority, women had also long been viewed with suspicion, as they were all descendants of Eve, the temptress of Adam, the cause of all that original sin, the inherent sinfulness of man, sinfulness of the human body, the expulsion from paradise, etc., etc. Meanwhile, in Renaissance Europe, Renaissance Florence, the flood of rediscovered Greek classical texts that were available routinely praised the perfection of the male form. And at roughly the same time, the rise of advice books and manuals to courtly behavior, which was ever more popular, more useful, as European states centralized around royal courts and really fostered a new elite of bureaucrats and courtiers. These types of texts prescribed the proper behavior and education for both men and women. So one of the most famous of these types of advice manuals, if you will, was the text written by Baldassare Castiglione, the courtier. It is, in a way, a sort of 16th century Emily Post style guide to conducting oneself as a gentleman or a gentlewoman. Like many Renaissance texts, it takes the form of a conversation between two people, in this case, two elite women, Elisabetta Gonzaga and Emilia Pia, and they're having a conversation about what exactly constitutes the ideal gentleman. Castiglione, who like others was heavily influenced by Cicero's De Officiis and De Oratore, these classical texts about how to be a good statesman and how to be a good speaker, that sort of thing. Castiglione indicated through this conversation between Elisabetta and Emilia that the ideal Renaissance gentleman was a government servant, someone who dedicated his life to the advancement of his country. So this kind of stood in contrast to the medieval ideal of a gentleman, of masculinity, in which the ideal man was usually a chivalrous knight who proved himself on the battlefield, and in his spare time sort of moonlighted as a troubadour, writing courtly poetry to his lady love. So they cover extensively what makes a really a Renaissance man, as we would call him now. But women are also discussed at length in this text. Elisabetta and Emilia continue their discussion, which in this text takes place over the course of about 4 days. And gradually men join the conversation. And Castiglione has such figures as Giuliano de' Medici speak up. So Giuliano counters the notion that women are only valuable as vessels for the production of children. He goes on to list historical women who have led nations to war and governed cities, and he praises the many charms of women. So he's sort of the counterpoint to this classical critique of women. Yet this should really not be seen as Castiglione declaring that women are equal to men. Elsewhere, he indicates that while men should do the politicking, women, as the courtly ladies, should create a refined atmosphere in which important business can be conducted. So their ultimate success, their aim, is to become the ideal hostess, charming and gracious and smoothing over little disagreements, and really just acting as, the gracious hostess. Of course, in reality, an adult woman's role was defined by her social position and married state. In a Florentine society that was really rigidly hierarchical, the ideal court lady, as discussed by Castiglione, was a role that only the married women of the most elite families could hope to play. So there used to be this old myth, or I shouldn't say myth, but historical interpretation, that Renaissance Florence, and this is keeping in line with many other misreadings of modernity into this period, witnessed a sort of transformation of the family unit from an older model that placed emphasis on grand, large families of lineage and fortunes preserved by primogeniture, into what we now call the nuclear family. So one father, one mother, and immediate children. So it goes from this large, extensive family in which you have sort of the kind of medieval ideal that we discussed in the first lecture, during the Renaissance, kind of winnowing down into these neat little family units, these nuclear family units. So this is a view that has now been thoroughly debunked by historians who have done a lot of archival research, because in reality, the so-called nuclear family has almost always been the normal shape of the Florentine household, really from ancient Rome through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, the early modern period, right up to present day. That is the most common household unit. However, in certain elite societies, elite levels of society, I should say, this also can include the family of any wives of sons. So I'll explain. In Renaissance Florence, in, let's say, a typical well-to-do merchant household, you would have a sort of pyramid shape with the pater familias, the father, the leader of the household at the top. So this is the oldest male of the family in the household, and everyone below him, his wife, sons, his sons' families, and their daughters, was legally subject to his patria potestas, or his legal power over them and all the family property, according to Roman law that was then practiced in Renaissance and early modern Florence. So as a point of fact, even family members and their supposedly personal wealth, such as the dowries that wives and the wives of sons brought to the family, were considered legally owned. They were considered the legal property of the pater familias, so he's a lucky guy. Um, Even married adult sons were still subject to the whims of their fathers. That is, until they were legally emancipated, given their own access to finances, and invested with the right to make their own decisions about matters concerning their finances. And this would happen either with the death of the paterfamilias or with his explicit consent. Until that point, they were under their father's thumb. In Florence, this was mitigated a bit by the fact that unemancipated sons could still engage in business if they had the proper merchant guild or artisan training, though regulations on emancipation and sons' activities were stricter in other Italian cities. Sons were often prohibited from marrying until their late 20s or 30s, while girls were married off at a much younger age to men who could, in certain cases, be considerably older than themselves. You can see why this might have been problematic for both young men and young women, what it might have been frustrating, and let's say why sodomy was also so widespread in Florence, which Michael Rock will explain in your secondary source for this week. So, returning to the family, at the head of the family unit you have the paterfamilias, who is essentially sitting pretty from a legal and religious standpoint. Few decisions in the family are made without his consent, and certainly not those regarding financial matters or, crucially, marriage arrangements for the children. All of these decisions would have been passed through the paterfamilias. So marriage itself was a very, let's say, dicey business and could make or destroy the wealth of an entire family. Although marriage itself was long seen as a sacrament by church scholars and was officially made a sacrament by the church at the 1438 Council of Florence, in practice, the ceremony itself was rarely conducted by a priest. It was much more common to have a notary solemnize the vows. In theory, even the exchange of vows before witnesses by the bride and groom could constitute a valid marriage. In fact, if the bride and groom even just promised to marry each other sometime in the future, all of this again conducted in the presence of witnesses, and then if they got straight away to consummating the marriage, before any ceremony was performed, this could still constitute a valid marriage. Now, it was precisely this rather open to interpretation attitude to the ceremony itself that the church would later seek to iron out with new reforms from the Council of Trent. Certainly, no, these informal arrangements were not the norm, but in late Renaissance Italy they were practiced, just generally not by elites, who certainly had a lot more at stake. Children, as I mentioned earlier, were prohibited from marrying against the paterfamilias' wishes by both Roman and local laws, and if nevertheless they eloped, they could be legally disinherited. So in theory, a daughter could refuse to marry a man chosen by her father if he was not considered a suitable match. And by suitable, I mean equal in social stature. But in practice, this rarely happened. Normally, a bride from a well-to-do or elite family had little or no say in her choice of husband. And once she married him, she and her dowry and other possessions would legally become part of her husband's or his father's household. In certain cases, such as Alessandra Strozzi's, as we'll see, a widow could negotiate marriage matches for her children. So in cases when the paterfamilias was dead or otherwise indisposed. And these marriage negotiations could take months or years as families sought suitable matches. Love was not really a thing spoken of or considered in these arrangements. Brides and grooms had to be socially and politically compatible, and brides, moreover, were considered more desirable if they were in their middle teenage years, healthy, demure, and pretty. The ricordanze, advice manuals, and other sources of information about marriage contracts that we have from the period don't generally have much to say about the attractiveness of the groom. In general, Florentine men were anywhere between 10 to 12 years older than their brides. This was due to a number of factors, sometimes because they delayed marriage until their sisters were paired off, or sometimes it was because they were still serving out an apprenticeship, or sometimes it was simply the will of the paterfamilias. Marriage agreements themselves were almost always conducted by proxies and were sealed with a handshake or a kiss between the representatives of the bride and groom's family. The bride was nearly never present at her own betrothal. Later, the exchange of vows between bride and groom would take place in a private setting. The groom would give the bride a ring, and festivities would follow. Later, the bride and groom would take all of her belongings, and they would be transferred into the house of her husband, and so her husband and perhaps her husband's father, if he was still in life. And this move also had a legal significance because it signaled to the government and to all the watchful neighbors that the marriage had been consummated and was considered legally valid and binding. So, what did a typical teenage wealthy bride bring to her new husband's family? Well, in the best of circumstances, she brought a hefty dowry, which, aside from her feminine charms, would almost certainly have been one of the main, if not the main reason, for her selection by her husband's family. Now, by law, the husband and father were required to preserve this dowry, which could include cash, but also property and household items. Though this wasn't always the way things turned out in reality. At times, husbands and their fathers were not the best custodians of their wives' dowries.